Hello, I'm Robert, and you're welcome here in my busy little shop. On today's episode of What's on My Workbench, I don't know if you watched my live stream or not, but I ended up with 4 winners of belts, and I'm working on the grand prize belt now. That was for Todd's Outside again, and he has a YouTube channel as well. So anyway, I'm going to be working on that, and he ordered a 1.5-inch Western belt, and I'm going to be doing that in dark golden brown, faded golden brown, and so I need the strips of leather for this belt. And if you haven't watched before, I make my belts out of 2 layers, a liner and a top. And so what I'll do is I'll get this one started, and this one is the Western. And it's got stitching in the top of it. And once I put that together, then I stitch the whole thing together on the edges. You'll see as you follow along here. I'm glad you're here in the shop with me today. Todd chose antique copper buckle. This is, well, it's not an antique buckle, but it's got a finish called antique copper. And I purchased this from Steckstore.com, and it's an 1.5-inch buckle. And then we're going to be putting these, probably a little hard to see through the plastic there, but these are antique copper spots that will be used on it. And then he wanted the dark brown thread. So I think that's going to make a striking belt, and it'll be a one of a kind. I have not made a Western with the antique copper finishes. So the next thing I need to do is I'm going to look over these straps, and I don't buy straps already cut for my belts. I get complete hides, and then I cut the straps myself. And then since it's a 2-layer belt, a lot of times if there's a little bit of a scar or something, I'll use that on the liner. So the first thing I'm going to do is examine this from one end to the other and see if there are any defects that I need to work around. They're both pretty clean pieces. So his belt is going to be a 37-inch belt, and for the strap, I need 10 inches longer than that, so I need 47 inches. That accounts for the fold over on the buckle end of the belt, and then the distance of the belt past the hole used on the belt. So what I end up doing is, even though I only need 10 inches, I'm going to make it, I'll probably just cut these straps at about 49 inches, and I'll trim it to length once I get them laminated together. All right, so I've got it marked here. I'll cut these to length. I don't want to get confused on which end is the fold over end on it. So this one's been thinned down a little bit. I thin that down where the fold over's at so that it's not too bulky underneath here. So this one's thinned down there. I need to thin this one down a little bit as well. I need to clean this area up. I'm getting a little bit cluttered here. On my fold over end, I fold over at 3.5 inches in. And to leave myself a little bit of room here to trim the end, I'm going to mark here at 4 inches. So the fold over will be about there. And I'll go ahead and fold this over for this next phase. The next thing I need to do on laying out the Western belt is to find where the center of the back will be on the person that's wearing the belt. And half of 37 is going to be 18.5, and that will be the center of Todd's belt in the back. So now that I've identified where the center of the belt is on the back, I'm going to lay out the Western belt here. And the way I do that is my pattern for that Western belt is 3 inches of stitching and a 1/2 inch gap. And the if you look here, this is 1 inch. So I use this stitching chisel 3 times in each of these, and then a 1/2 inch gap. The next thing I do, I don't have an exact measurement, I eyeball what looks right. This is going to be where the center stitches are. And then I just put a light scribe line along here where those go. Just from one stitching area to the next. Then to further ensure that I end up with it centered in the back, I start here where that spot's at with my stitching chisel, centering it on that spot. And then I just work my way to each end of the belt, skipping over this spot where the copper spot will go. Okay, once I get this side done, what I do then is I use my square and I line up to make sure that these holes align. So I'll put it in the holes, bump it up the square to it, transfer over to here. And I'll just do that on each of these sets to the other end. Now I've got all of these holes finished for the pattern. There'll be a antique copper spot in each one of these open fields. I'm going to run both of these through the die, and then we'll let that sit and dry. All right, so the die has dried, and I went ahead and put a coat of Resin on there. That's dry. So I'm going to do these center stitches now. And Todd asked for brown stitching. I've got the Tiger Ritza in the dark brown. And I'll measure off the thread I need here. I think it's worth repeating, but on the belts that I make that have the decorative stitching down the middle of the belt, I typically do that through just the top layer of the belt. It's not needed for the construction for it to go through both layers. And I find it gives a cleaner looking backside to the belt, which maybe it's more important to me than anybody else, but I think it makes a better, more professional looking belt that way. And when I get to the spot here, both of my threads travel along the back to this next section, and I'm not having to start and stop stitching, tie off the thread and start a new section. I guess that would be another way you could do it as well. But I think it just makes a much cleaner looking belt to do it that way. At this point, I've got the center stitching done. And before I laminate the two layers together, I need to make the holes and install these antique copper finished rivets here. And I'm just using them as spots. They're not holding any layers together. They're decorative. And yes, I just eyeball that. It is difficult to draw lines and get it in the right spot. To set these, I don't want to mash on the front because it'll flatten out that dome. I don't want to do that. So the way I do that is instead of using this, I'll get myself the cutting board here, and it's somewhat soft. You can see some impressions here where I've used it before. And then I'll take a piece of cardboard here and I kind of mash down on it, and it makes an indentation in the cardboard, kind of holds it upright so it doesn't want to tip over on me. And then I'll just nail it from behind. There we go. I'm just going to do that down through here on each one of those. You can see kind of making an impression there and there. And it just seems like that works pretty good for the way that I do this. This is the second coat of contact adhesive. I let it set up between the two coats. The first one pretty much seals the leather, and the second one provides the really good adhesion. When I laminate these two together, this is going to have a bend in it like this, and if I laminate it flat and I roll it over, careful touching here, it will end up with a bunch of wrinkles here, and I don't like that. I suppose it really doesn't hurt anything, but I prefer not to have that. So what I'll do is I will line this up on here, and I will put a little bit of a pre-bend in the leather here. And that will help eliminate some of those wrinkles there. I'm going to tap along here and get these somewhat held together, and then I'll burnish it in place. I'm going to get the belt cut to length, and we'll make the hole here for the buckle. Now I'll cut this to the finished length, adding 10 inches to the total length of the belt. And if you remember, this is a 37, so I want 47. And I'll use my CS Osborne 1.5 inch English point lined up between those two spots and lined up on the tail. I will sand and finish these edges, but I like to do the next step first, and that's to establish my stitch line. If anything, leave yourself short here, because if you cut off the edge, it'll be real noticeable. But when I put the hole here at the beginning, you won't really notice that I stayed back just a hair there. I'm going to use my Weaver 5mm stitching chisels here, starting with a single one at the tip. And I like to back it up with leather. It's easier than doing it on the cutting surface. Plus, this has got a lot of texture to it, and it seems like it wants to imprint the back if I go down through there. Using my double tine here. Switch to my 6 tine. And I'm gonna follow this all the way to the other end. And then when I'm done, we'll come back here. Now that I've completed making all of the holes, and you can see here earlier on I was talking about this light color here. The thread's covered up pretty much all of that. And when I put the clear on, it'll mask the rest of it. But I complete the saddle stitch here, and I'm using the same Tiger Ritza thread that I used in the center. And I measure off a length that's 3.5, 4 times the length of each side. And the saddle stitch, then I use that thread starting at the tip and work my way down to the buckle end of the belt on each side. And I know some people just use, like, 5 feet, 6 feet, so they're not dealing with such a long thread on there. And that probably does make it go a little bit quicker, but then you have to start and stop in the middle of the belt. And when I do this, the way I'm doing it, all I've got is the ending point, and it's in the fold over area of the belt. So it's not visible at all. I guess unless you take the belt off and look at the back of the buckle area there, then you can probably see a little bit there because it's got a double stitch. But I'll just work my way to the other end of this. Once I get done, then I'll finish the edges out. And I like to do that after the stitching because sometimes you get a little bit of a pucker along here, and this helps even that out because I'll trim it even once the stitching is done. Finished all of the stitching on this belt. I do have to stitch the keeper yet. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use my Ron's edger, and I'm going to cut the edges on this. That's Ron's number 4. The 4 takes a pretty good chunk out of the belt. This belt here is a little bit on the thicker side from what I typically do. Typically my belts, I usually shoot for about 12 ounces. I'm gonna stop here and I'll explain why in a second. But I usually shoot for 12 ounces on the thickness of the belt. And this one here is about 13.5. The reason why I didn't go all the way around the end of the fold over part is that's thinner leather there, and I'm afraid that it would be too thick for that and actually cut into the edge instead of rounding the edge. So I'm going to use my number 3 on this thinner area here. And it's at that bend. You would never notice it if I didn't tell anybody. I'll flip it over here and do the back. And on the belt here, I start about where this is here. I've done it both ways where I come all the way around here, but I think it makes a cleaner look when that belt is folded over, not to have it rounded there. I've done it both ways. You can, try it and see which way you like it the best. That gives a nice rounded edge here. And what I'll do next is I'll do a little bit of light sanding. It doesn't really look like it needs much. And then I'll go ahead and burnish this edge so that it's slick. It'll be just as slick as the face of the belt. And I'll go ahead and address it here because I think some people, everybody's got opinions on how the belt should be made. And I don't mind if the edge has a little bit of a flat area, rounded, flat, rounded. A lot of people think it should be rounded all the way through. And I'm not saying it shouldn't. I think it's a preference thing. And let me show you here how it looks. I get to focus in the right area there. It's a nice look. So this one here is pretty much rounded all the way through. Doesn't have a flat area on it. The edge is a lot darker right now, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's wet. So some of that darkness will go away when it dries. The sheen will stay about the same, especially when I get the next coat of Resolene on the belt. trying not to push overly hard. It's more about creating friction to get that sheen. You can see a little bit here where I go from the number 4 to the number 3, but once you get it bent like this, the buckle put on there, you won't see any of that. I'll let the water dry out of the edge here, and then we'll put a coat of Resin on here. The next thing I need to do is get my keeper made for the belt, and I have cut a 1/2 inch strip of the same leather dyed at the same time. And the next thing I'll do is to create the stitch lines on here, but I need to figure out the length of this to create the loop. So I'm just going to double this over, because effectively that's what we'll have going through there. I've got a mark right there, so I'll cut it there, and then I'm just going to mark along the edge, put the holes in, and stitch this. When I tap that in, it kind of flattens those stitches out and embeds them slightly in the leather. And I need to go back and redo my burnish a little bit on the edges here, and then I'll put Resin front and back. Then once that's all done, then I'll sew these ends together here. Speaking of that, I haven't set this one in yet. And it's not a whole lot of pounding, it's just a light setting of that thread. And I don't know if you can see, but it really helps define that stitch once it's been flattened out. Okay, time for Resin. I really work it into the threads. I want to make sure that that color is sealed in as much as possible to limit the rub off. And I know there's people out there that don't like the Resin, they don't like the sheen of it, but I like how it seals the dye in. So that's what I use. So we're ready here for our final assembly. I decided that the black didn't draw as much attention as the brass did. So we're ready for our final assembly. I went ahead and sewed the keeper into a loop, and I need to make the holes now for the Chicago screws. So it's Monday morning. I finished most of this belt up on Sunday. This is a one-of-a-kind belt. I have not made another Western with the antique copper spots or buckle. The last thing I need to do is to make the holes for the adjustment. And it's a 37-inch belt. I make 2 holes larger and 2 holes smaller. Working with leather kind of reminds me in some ways of woodworking. And what I mean by that is when it comes to coloring the leather, it's not as predictable as some might think. It's more like working with wood where one piece might dye a little differently than the next. This belt came out, I think, a little lighter than I kind of anticipated it coming out. But it's a beautiful belt, and I hope that the owner of it will love it as much as me. There we go. That's the buckle side and the back. I do appreciate everyone that took the time to enter into my contest, and congratulations to the winners. I've talked to all 3 of them at this point. I've got 2 of them finished and waiting on size and color selection from one yet. Well, there we go. First belt is finished. That's the grand prize belt for Todd's Outside Again. And it's a one-of-a-kind belt for what I'm sure is a one-of-a-kind guy. Hey, I mean that nice. And I'll get that in the mail today. Please like, share, and subscribe. And more importantly, have a great day.